Life in the housing complex often felt monotonous. Security was maintained by guards who patrolled the watch post. But who would have thought that behind the seemingly calm nights, there was a chilling mystery hidden in the corners of the security post? Tonight, an old forgotten story resurfaces. Someone or something is waiting, and no one knows who will be the next victim. That night felt quieter than usual. A cold breeze slipped through the small gaps in the windows of the security post. Ridwin, a security guard who had worked at the complex for almost 10 years, was sitting comfortably in his chair. On the table, a nearly empty cup of coffee stood next to a small notebook where he recorded who came in and out. The clock showed 2 in the morning. The quietest time in the complex, when most of the residents were fast asleep. Ridwin stared at the CCTV screen, showing empty streets around the complex, with nothing suspicious in sight. Suddenly, a soft knock sounded from the door of the post. Ridwin turned toward the door, his eyebrows furrowing. Who could it be at this hour? No cars had passed by, and nothing appeared approaching the post on the CCTV. "Who's out there?" Ridwin asked in a firm tone, trying to suppress the discomfort creeping into his mind. No answer, just silence, which only heightened the tension. After a few seconds, the knock came again, this time louder. Ridwin stood up and walked toward the door. When he opened it, there was no one there. The street was empty, lit only by dim street lights. The cold night air sent a shiver down his spine. Cautiously, Ridwin stepped outside, looking in every direction. Suddenly, a faint giggle echoed from the dark corner of the post. The laugh was soft, like the sound of a child playing. However, in such a cold night, it was impossible for any child to be out. "Who's there?" Ridwin asked, his voice starting to tremble. No answer, only the gentle sound of the night wind. Ridwin felt that something was terribly wrong. He quickly went back inside the post, closed the door tightly, and tried to calm himself. But inside, the tension only grew. A strange feeling crept into his mind, as if something was watching him from the darkness. When he sat down again, the CCTV screen, which previously showed an empty street, changed. One of the cameras, pointed at a small park near the post, showed a shadowy figure. Ridwin leaned closer. Under the shadow of a large tree, someone was sitting on a park bench, not moving at all. Ridwin tried to zoom in, but the image remained blurry. Suddenly, the lights in the post flickered, and the CCTV screen turned to static for a few seconds before returning to normal. Ridwin felt his heart pounding. When he looked back at the screen, the figure that had been sitting on the bench was gone. Since the strange apparition on the CCTV, Ridwin could not relax. Every second felt like an endless terror. His eyes kept glued to the screen, hoping not to see something even more frightening. But the unbearable curiosity led him to glance back toward the small park outside the post. The park lights, usually bright, now flickered, as if something was disturbing the electrical flow. Ridwin stood up, looking out through the post window, and saw the figure again, a woman. Her long hair covered most of her face. She stood near the park bench, not moving. With a mix of fear and curiosity, Ridwin stepped out of the post. His steps were slow, and the night air grew more chilling. As he approached the park, the figure began to step back, retreating deeper into the darkness. Each time Ridwin tried to get closer, the woman moved further away, until she finally disappeared behind the shadow of a large tree. Ridwin halted. Cold sweat dripped from his forehead. Was this real, or just a trick of his mind in the stillness of the night? However, before he could return to the post, the familiar sound of soft laughter echoed again, this time clearer and closer. He turned around, and there, in the dark corner, the figure reappeared, standing no more than a few meters from him. The woman's face started to become visible. Her skin was pale, her eyes pitch black, and her lips formed a strange smile that made Ridwin feel his entire body freeze. He stepped back slowly, but the woman remained still, staring unblinkingly. As they tried to turn back and find a way out, something terrifying happened. The tunnel they had just passed through suddenly split into multiple directions. They were confused because previously there had only been one path. Mike, trying to stay calm, told them to stick together, but the darkness and fear slowly began to take over. Lucy started to feel short of breath. "This doesn't make sense," she murmured, sobbing. "We should be almost out by now." However, there was no sign of an exit, no sign of the outside world. Only deepening darkness, accompanied by strange sounds echoing from behind the tunnel walls. In the distance, shadows began to appear, getting closer. Tall, thin figures moved at the edge of their vision, disappearing before they could be clearly seen. They were not alone in this tunnel. As they stood at the crossroads of tunnels that shouldn't exist, the silence was broken by a distant rumbling sound. It was as if something heavy was moving, vibrating beneath their feet. The air inside the tunnel grew more suffocating, making each breath feel harder. "Should we choose one path?" Mike asked anxiously. "We have no other choice," Ethan replied, his voice trembling. "We can't stay here." They chose the far right path and began walking at a faster pace. However, the farther they went, the more strange things appeared on the walls, not just symbols, but scratches that looked like hands. It was as if someone, or something, had tried to crawl out from inside the walls. No one mentioned this being part of the old tunnels, Lucy whispered, her eyes fixed on the walls that now seemed more terrifying. "This isn't normal." Jess began to feel a presence. "I can feel it. We are being watched," she said softly. She glanced back, her eyes staring into the darkness that seemed to swallow them whole. Soon after, Ethan suddenly stopped, shining his flashlight towards the wall in front of him. "There's something there," he said tensely. In the distance, two faint red dots appeared. At first, they seemed small, like reflections of light, but they grew larger over time. Then they realized those were eyes glowing in the dark. They were frozen, unable to move. As the figure behind those eyes began moving closer, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed throughout the tunnel. Each step sounded like thunder inside their heads. "Run!" Mike shouted. Without thinking twice, they started running as fast as they could. But the heavy footsteps didn't stop following them. The figure with the red eyes kept getting closer, its sound growing louder, as if the tunnel was amplifying its presence. Running through the underground tunnels intensified their fear. Every turn they took felt like running towards a trap, further away from the outside world. They were trapped in a place that seemed to have no end. However, after a few minutes of running, they suddenly reached a large room. In the middle of the room was something strange and old, well, covered in thick cobwebs. The beam from their flashlight reflected off the puddle of water at the bottom of the well, casting eerie shadows around them. "What is this place?" Lucy asked, panting. No one knew. This room didn't look like part of the old tunnels they expected to explore. It felt more like an ancient altar. On the walls surrounding the room, symbols were carved, much larger and more intricate than those they had seen in the previous tunnels. Ethan stared at the well with a worried look. "This isn't part of the history I know," he muttered. "This is older." As they stood there in shock, the sound of heavy footsteps returned, this time much closer. The figure with the red eyes was closing in. "Into the well," Mike shouted. With no other option, they jumped into the well, plunging into deeper darkness. Cold water touched their bodies as they fell, sinking into something more than just ordinary water. When they emerged from the water, the well was not as deep as they had thought. However, the darkness around them grew even thicker. They realized that below the water, there were other passages, even narrower and more terrifying than the tunnels they had been through. They had to crawl out of the water and squeeze into the narrow passage, trying to find an exit. Their hands felt slippery with slime and moss, and the stench grew stronger. Jess began whispering, her voice trembling, "This can't be real. We should have been out by now." But every time they tried to turn in a different direction, the passage kept leading them deeper into the darkness. They couldn't find a way out, and the sound of heavy footsteps still followed them, even though the figure with the red eyes was no longer visible. Every second in the passage felt like an hour. They lost track of time, losing hope of ever escaping. But in the distance, a dim light began to appear. It wasn't a warm or comforting light, but more like a cold, strange flicker, seemingly coming from deep within the earth. "Whatever it is, we have to go there," Mike said desperately. "It might be our only way out." They walked toward the strange light, passing through narrow, wet walls. Each step felt heavier than the last, but hope began to grow as the light got closer. However, when they finally reached the source of the light, they were shocked to see a large gate made of rusty metal, covered in thick cobwebs. Behind the gate, a faint light flickered, but there was no sign of the outside world. Ethan approached and tried to push the gate, but it didn't budge. At the top of the gate, there was an engraving of the same symbols they had seen on the tunnel walls, as if the gate was guarded by a force greater than just old metal. "We have to find a way to open this," Lucy said, her voice growing more panicked. They started searching around the gate, trying to find a key or mechanism to open it. But nothing made sense. As they began investigating the old rusted metal gate, the feeling of fear intensified. No one could find a mechanism or a way to open it. Every attempt they made resulted in the sound of metal clanging, echoing down the tunnel. "It's like we're trapped here," Ethan said, struggling to push the gate, but to no avail. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed again, this time much closer. The figure they had been trying to forget seemed to be approaching faster, its red eyes still glowing in the distance, and each step made the tunnel walls shake. "We need to find a way out, now," Lucy urged, panic evident in her voice. Her hands trembled as she ran them along the tunnel walls, searching for any crack or clue that could help. As the footsteps grew closer, Mike was the first to notice something. To the right of the gate, there was a small crack, barely noticeable. It looked like a crevice in the stone, just large enough for someone to crawl through. "Hurry, we don't have much time," Mike said, pointing to the crack. One by one, they began crawling into the narrow crevice, leaving behind the large gate and the sound of heavy footsteps. As they crawled deeper, they realized the crack wasn't just a hole, it was a hidden passage, perhaps one that hadn't been used in decades or even centuries. However, the deeper they went, the harder it became to breathe. The passage was narrower than before, and they had to crawl on their hands and knees. "I don't like this," Jess whispered, her voice barely audible in the darkness. Finally, the passage led them into a small room filled with strange objects, pieces of wood, old metal relics, and carvings of the same mysterious symbols they'd seen before. In the corner of the room stood a small statue made of black stone, gazing at them with an empty stare. Ethan approached the statue, feeling something was wrong. "I feel like this statue is watching us," he said slowly. "This has to be connected to the tunnels," Lucy said, staring uneasily at the statue. Behind them, a rumbling sound echoed. They quickly turned, realizing that the heavy footsteps they'd been hearing all along were now in the same room as them. Though the red eyes were no longer visible, they could feel the presence lurking behind every shadow. Something large and menacing was waiting for them. Suddenly, a cold wind blew from a crack in the wall. The statue in the corner seemed to tremble, and the carvings on the walls began to glow with an eerie light. They all stood on alert, the growing anxiety filling their hearts. The strange light from the walls intensified, flooding the room with an unsettling bluish-green glow. "Something's happening," Jess whispered, her voice almost inaudible. She clutched her wrist, where a sudden, sharp pain emerged. The statue, which had seemed immobile and lifeless, began to change. Suddenly, from behind the black stone, a pair of small red eyes appeared, glaring at them with hatred. The statue was not just an inanimate object, it was a gateway to something far more evil. "We need to get out of here," Mike shouted, his voice laced with urgency. Before they could flee, a small door on the other side of the room creaked open, revealing an even darker and narrower passage. The large figure that had been following them all this time now stood at the threshold, and this time, it revealed itself. A massive body, covered in burns and scars, with glowing red eyes filled with malice. In an instant, the room became a battleground both mentally and physically. Mike, Lucy, Ethan, and Jess fought for their survival by any means necessary. They used the cramped space and nearby objects to try and block the creature's advance, but the force they were up against was beyond human understanding. Jess screamed as the creature nearly reached her, but Ethan managed to push a large statue in its path, causing the creature to stumble. However, it didn't stop, it continued moving with terrifying strength. "This is endless," Mike shouted in despair. Amid the battle, a soft voice echoed in Jess's mind. It wasn't a sound from outside, but one from within her thoughts. The voice urged her to approach the statue in the center of the room and do something she couldn't quite understand. "Go to the statue," Jess shouted to the others. Without thinking of the risks, they approached the statue in the center of the room. When Jess placed her hand on the black stone statue, the room began to shake violently. The blue light from the walls grew brighter, and the large creature started to slow down, seemingly affected by something. Under Jess's touch, the statue began to change, cracking into several small pieces, revealing something shining inside a rusty old key, but one radiating immense power. "This key might be our only way out," Ethan murmured. They raced against time, carrying the key to the large door at the end of the passage. The massive creature that had been chasing them grew weaker, seemingly trapped by the force unleashed by the key. As the key was inserted into the lock of the gate, a loud noise reverberated, followed by an explosion of light. The ancient gate opened, revealing a tunnel that led them upwards, out of the darkness of the nightmare tunnels. They had escaped the darkness of the underground tunnels, filled with mystery and terrifying creatures. However, even though they were outside, the shadows of the tunnels would always haunt them. Was the tunnel truly sealed, or were there still secrets waiting for them to return? Would you dare explore the old tunnels in your city? Don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments and click subscribe for more horror stories. Who knows, the next tunnel could be right beneath your feet.